Good afternoon, everyone. I am Coco, and today I'll be proposing my service learning project titled SEN. So, senso in Japanese means war. Replacing the S in the senso with the N, on the other hand, would be read as senno, meaning brainwashing. I believe this to be the inevitable state of war history education. We forget history isn't a fact. History isn't what happened, it's really who tells the story. What is taught in our history classes at school are merely the story that the school wants to tell. In the case of a government school teaching government curricula, it is the story that the Ministry of Education wants to tell. Today, I want to tell the story that the Japanese Ministry of Education has been telling to the Japanese student community about the history of World War II and how that is a problem. Today, history textbooks used in junior high schools in Japan as part of social studies have a mere 12 pages covering World War II in the Pacific. A whopping 3 pages covers the European theater in World War II, totally irrelevant to the Pacific. I personally took a look at the secondary school history textbook most recently used in Japan. In this, there was a mere 8 pages covering World War II. The first 2 pages were not even on World War II in the Pacific, but instead were on World War II in the West, which seemed to me as Japan's deflection of blame onto Germany for their actions during World War II. The next few pages were largely on Japan-US relations during World War II, which seemed to me as Japan's attempt to highlighting themselves as the victim of war due to the association of the US with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. I must give some extent of credit to the textbook though, for it does list and slightly elaborate on the countries that Japan invaded, occupied, and mistreated during World War II. I say slightly elaborate, however, because the textbook is unwilling to provide clarity on the actual damage that Japan inflicted on these countries. The textbook writes many, I quote, when elaborating on the number of casualties these countries suffered as a result of the Japanese occupation, instead of stating an explicit number. Throughout the textbook, I also observed many instances of glorification of the Japanese during World War II, with mentions of people like Shinozaki Mamoru, who is known to be Japan's Schindler. He saved a lot of Jews during World War II, as well as mentions of Japanese people's perseverance toward the end of World War II, when they were losing and ended up being victims of war. So yes, this to the countries that were occupied during World War II is shocking, utterly shocking, upsetting. These countries have history textbooks with several chapters covering World War II and the Japanese occupation. These history textbooks are very explicit in stating the number of casualties and the manner of massacres they suffered from the Japanese. There's a clear difference in how Japan and its neighboring countries teach war and its events. The lack of content covering World War II in Japanese textbooks gives off the impression that Japan just does not recognize the damage it has inflicted onto other countries during the war. This is the reason why there are still ongoing feuds between Japan and countries such as Korea, China, etc. to this day. As such, Japanese students are ignorant to the rounded course of events of Japan's involvement in World War II. The ignorance is not only due to the lack of content on the topic within the Japanese Ministry of Education's curriculum, like I mentioned earlier, but also due to, one, the increasing lack of personal connection to war, because, well, experience of war are slowly dying and decreasing in number, so there's just not interest in learning about the war. And 2, there's lack of access to information because of Japan's Taishu Bunka, which is like this mass culture of like hate towards people who give radical ideas. And that's why there's so many Japanese users on Twitter, because they can maintain that anonymity. Third one is lack of access to information simply due to the language barrier, because a lot of Japanese people living in Japan, they're not versed in English. So this next slide is a very clear example of why this ignorance happens. So when I search up the SEN Railway in Japanese, which is where Japan forced labor onto POWs, the prisoners of war during World War II, it presents 2 results. As compared to when you search it up in English, wow, 476,000 results. So very clear indication of that ignorance. So some of the existing solutions for this is the organization called Peace Boat. So Peace Boat is an organization in Japan, kick-started because of a textbook controversy that happened in the 90s. So people in Korea, China, and even Japan were complaining about how there's not much clarity in Japanese textbooks on the war. So now Peace Boat conducts annual cruise ships where they gather people from all over the world to discuss these controversial topics, including this topic and like maybe refugee crisis and discussion between people of diverse perspectives. And the second solution is Japanese guided tours of Singapore History Gallery and the National Museum of Singapore. This is a tour guided by Japanese people to educate like Japanese tourists and Japanese people living in Singapore about the Japanese occupation of Singapore. So during the break, I participated in the tour. And this is a Japanese student living in Japan, studying in Japan's private high school. And I had a conversation with her about the before and after to see how much impact this existing solution really makes. And before the tour, she talked to me about how she only knew about the Pearl Harbor, but that's because her dad was American. And she only knew about the Japanese occupation of like countries like Korea and China. She didn't know that the Japanese occupation expanded to countries in Southeast Asia. But after that, she got to know the history of the Japanese occupation of Singapore. She told me about how she was deeply emotionally affected by the story of the Soup Chicken Massacre. The existing solutions I mentioned earlier, they're really like voluntary and available and accessible to only people who know about these organizations. But in my service learning project, I hope to educate this perspective to people who are unaware about the war due to the circumstances that I've explained earlier on. My driving question is how can I educate Japanese students on the roundup version of Japan's involvement in World War II for them to discover their Japanese identity and its implications globally? Why I see value in this project personally is because of my personal experience learning about the Japanese occupation of Singapore and Singapore's government schools. Learning about the war was painful, but it made me feel closer to Japan because why I was feeling this sense of guilt is really because I felt Japanese at heart, despite the physical distance. To the majority of the Japanese community, on the other hand, they do not recognize the value of this project because they don't know this history exists. And this is not by choice, this is simply by circumstance. So hopefully my service learning project will allow them to see a glimpse of this history and allow them to see value in this project. So I kind of covered this earlier, but the topic area that I'll be focusing on in this service would be Japan's involvement in World War II, but I can't cover everything about the war. In this service, I want to focus on Singapore's perspective and educate Japanese students living in Singapore about the Japanese occupation of Singapore. Self-explanatory SDG goals, quality education as a direct impact, and then the indirect impact I believe to be peace, justice, and strong institutions, because by educating, it will provide a sense of closure to Korean people, Chinese people, Singaporean people, that, when we as Japanese people apologize for the war or like say, I'm so sorry for your loss, it's a genuine apology, not a fake one. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.